The black SUV screeched to a stop in front of the burning building. Inside, a woman screamed. Kang Min-ho, the most feared man in Seoul's criminal underground, had never run toward anything in his life. He only ever walked away. But something about that voice, something about her. He broke through the door, and when his eyes found her curvy, terrified, breathtaking in the firelight, his chest cracked open like a fault line splitting the earth. He hadn't believed in anything for 15 years. In 3 seconds, that changed. Welcome to AfroKorean romance, where love has no borders. If you believe in love, please like, share, and subscribe for more AfroKorean romance stories. The Han household was the kind of place that swallowed people whole. Perched on a hillside in the most exclusive neighborhood in Seoul, the estate sprawled across 3 acres of manicured silence. Iron gates, security cameras at every angle, guards who looked through people rather than at them. It was not a home. It was a fortress disguised as luxury, and everyone who worked inside it knew the difference. Nadiya Osei had known it from her first day. She was 26, Ghanaian-born, Seoul-educated, and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, which was exactly how she preferred it. Her English degree from Yonsei University had not opened the doors she'd hoped, not in a city where connections mattered more than credentials, and her face still made people pause in ways that had nothing to do with beauty. So she had taken the domestic position at the Kang estate through an agency, telling herself it was temporary. That had been 8 months ago. She didn't mind the work. She was thorough, quiet, and invisible in the way that kept her safe. She cleaned rooms that smelled of expensive cologne and colder choices. She prepared schedules for a household that ran like a corporation. She stayed out of everyone's way, especially his. Kang Min-ho. She had seen him exactly 6 times in 8 months, always at a distance. Always moving fast, flanked by men in dark suits, his face carved from something harder than stone. He was 38, Korean Mafia royalty, the head of the Kang Syndicate, which the government officially pretended didn't exist and unofficially relied upon to manage the criminal architecture of half the peninsula. He was 6 feet of controlled danger, black hair always immaculate, jaw always tight, eyes the color of deep water in winter. Nadiya had made a personal rule on day 1, do not look directly at Kang Min-ho. It was, she had decided, the same rule one applied to solar eclipses and open flames. The morning that changed, everything began like every other. She was in the east wing, changing the linens in the guest corridor, when she heard it, small footsteps, deliberate and sneaky, followed by a very serious throat clearing from someone approximately 4 feet tall. She turned. A boy stood in the hallway, arms crossed, wearing a tiny suit jacket over his pajama pants. He had his father's eyes, dark, direct, and startlingly intelligent, but his expression was pure chaos. "I've been watching you," the boy announced. Nadiya blinked. "Good morning to you, too." "You fold the corners differently than Miss Park did." He tilted his head. "I like yours better, the sheets don't puff up." "Thank you," she said carefully. "I'm Kang Jihun," he said, extending a hand with devastating formality. "I'm 10. My father runs this house and also, I think, several other things I'm not supposed to know about." Nadiya bit back a smile and shook his hand. "I'm Nadiya, I clean things." "I know." He studied her with an intensity that was unsettlingly familiar. "You also hum when you think no one's listening. You hummed a song yesterday that my mother used to sing." The smile faded slightly. She'd heard the boy's mother had passed 3 years ago, cancer. She chose her next words carefully. "It's a song from where I grew up, a lullaby." Jihun was quiet for a moment, processing this with a gravity too large for his small face. Then he nodded, once, like he'd reached a conclusion. "I think," he said solemnly, "that you should stay here forever." She didn't tell anyone about the conversation, but Jihun came back the next morning, and the one after that. He appeared in doorways and at the top of staircases with the persistence of someone who had decided, completely and without apology, that Nadiya was now his person. He told her about school, about the kids who whispered about his father, about how he pretended not to care. He told her about his mother, slowly, in pieces, like he was testing whether she'd handle it gently. She always did. She told him about Ghana, about her grandmother's cooking and the sound of the market at dawn. She taught him 3 words in Twi. He practiced them with the ferocity of a child memorizing a battle cry. By the end of the 2nd week, Jihun had reorganized his entire morning routine to coincide with wherever Nadiya was working. What she didn't know was that his father had noticed. Kang Min-ho noticed most things. It was not a talent. It was a survival mechanism so deeply ingrained it had become indistinguishable from instinct. He noticed the shift in his son's posture, the way Jihun now moved through the house with something lighter in his step, how the boy had started humming at breakfast. He had his head of security pull the East Wing camera logs. He watched the footage 3 times. The woman moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, but it was the moments between tasks that stopped him. When she'd pause to look at the photograph on Jihun's wall, the one of his late mother, and press her lips together like she was holding something in. When she laughed at something Jihun said, and the sound seemed to surprise even her. When she sat on the hallway floor, and listened to his son talk with an attention that Minho recognized as rare and real. He sat back in his chair. He didn't know her name. He looked it up in the staff files. Nadiya Osei, age 26, University of Yonsei Literature, agency placement 8 months, exemplary record, no incidents. He read it twice. Then he did something he hadn't done with any other staff member in 4 years of running this household. He memorized it. He saw her in person 3 days later, which he would later understand was not an accident. His feet had simply carried him toward the East Wing at an hour he didn't normally move through it, and he had stopped pretending that was a coincidence before he'd even reached the landing. She was in the corridor, arms full of folded linens, when she turned the corner and nearly walked directly into his chest. She froze. He froze. He was close enough to see the exact moment she recognized him, the slight widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of her spine. Not fear, precisely. Something more layered than that. Awareness. Caution. And then, because she was apparently constitutionally incapable of full retreat, a carefully composed expression. "Mr. Kang," she said. Her voice was low and steady. "I apologize I didn't see you." "You were carrying too much to see anything," he said. His own voice came out rougher than intended. A beat. She adjusted the linens in her arms. He should have walked away. He had 14 meetings, 2 phone calls with men who were afraid of him, and a situation in Busan that required his attention before noon. He didn't walk away. "My son speaks of you," he said instead. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "He speaks of you too." That surprised him. He wasn't sure why. "What does he say?" "That you work too much." She met his eyes for exactly a second, direct, unafraid, and then carefully away. "He says it like he's proud of you anyway." Minho said nothing. His chest did something unusual. "Excuse me," Nadiya said quietly, and moved past him with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent months learning to disappear. He stood in the corridor for longer than he'd like to admit. Jihun's campaign was not subtle. Within the week, the boy had begun leaving small things in Nadiya's path, a book he thought she'd like, a piece of fruit from breakfast with a note that said you always skip this. He redirected his homework sessions from the study to whatever room she happened to be working in, setting up at a side table with the gravity of a scholar and the scheming of a very small general. Nadiya pretended not to notice the strategy. She helped with his math anyway. What she couldn't pretend not to notice was Kang Min-ho. He had begun appearing, that was the only word for it. Not seeking her out, never anything as direct as that, but present. In the kitchen when she was coordinating the morning schedule. In the courtyard when she crossed it on her way to the East Wing. Once, memorably. In the doorway of the library at 11 at night, when she'd returned a book she'd borrowed from the lower shelf. And he'd been sitting in the dark by the window, papers in hand, and had looked up with an expression that suggested he'd known she would come. She'd excused herself in 4 seconds flat. She reported none of this to anyone. There was nothing to report. He never spoke inappropriately. He barely spoke at all. He simply existed in the same spaces as her with an intensity that made breathing feel like work. She started taking different routes through the house. He adjusted accordingly. She was almost certain she wasn't imagining it. The other staff noticed, even if they said nothing directly. Mrs. Cho, the head housekeeper, watched Nadiya with sharp eyes over the rim of her tea one morning and said nothing for a long moment. He doesn't usually learn the staff's names, she finally offered. Nadiya kept her eyes on the schedule. I'm sure he knows all of our names. He asked me yours specifically, Mrs. Cho said. 3 weeks ago, before you'd spoken to him. Silence. I'll finish the East Wing inventory today, Nadiya said. Mrs. Cho smiled into her tea. Of course you will. The tension might have stayed manageable if not for Park Sung-jin. He was Minho's second cousin, charming in the way that expensive things sometimes were all surface and shine. He visited the estate occasionally for family business, and he had a talent for locating whatever was most interesting in a room and moving toward it with the instincts of someone who'd never been told no. He found Nadiya in the garden on a Thursday afternoon, where she'd been sent to oversee the floral delivery. You're new, he said, falling into step beside her without invitation. 8 months, she said, not looking up from her clipboard. New to me, he smiled. It was a practiced smile calibrated to charm. I would have remembered. She looked at him then, briefly, assessingly, and he saw her categorize him with an efficiency that was almost insulting. The delivery is scheduled for 3 o'clock. Was there something you needed from the main house? Park Sung-jin blinked, then laughed, genuinely charmed by the dismissal. I'll figure something out, he said. Across the courtyard, framed in the window of his office, Kang Min-ho watched this exchange with his hands very still on his desk, and something very loud happening behind his eyes. By evening, Park Sung-jin had been redirected to the Busan property on urgent business. Nadiya never found out why his visit had been cut short. On a bright Saturday morning, Jihun gathered Nadiya in the east sitting room under the pretense of showing her a school project. The project turned out to be a hand-drawn poster. At the top, in careful crayon letters, "Will you marry me?" Below it, a drawing of 3 figures, a tall one in a suit, a smaller one with a school bag, and a third, round and bright, with curly hair and a wide smile that was, unmistakably, meant to be Nadiya. She stared at it for a very long moment. Jihun, she said carefully. It's for you, he explained very seriously, and also for a byoji. I drew you together because I think you match. Your father and I. You make him slow down, Jihun said, with a 10-year-old's devastating precision. When you're in a room, he stops moving fast. I watch him. He held up the poster with both hands. I did research. What kind of research? I asked Mrs. Cho what it means when a person stops rushing. She said it means they found something worth staying for. Nadiya's throat tightened. Jihun. You can keep the poster, he said graciously. I made a copy. She looked at the drawing for a long moment, the 3 figures, careful and hopeful in crayon, and felt something she had been deliberately not feeling begin to crack through anyway. She didn't get the chance to process it. Minho appeared in the doorway, and his eyes went immediately to the poster in her hands. A silence stretched between all 3 of them. Jihun looked between them with the satisfaction of someone who had engineered exactly this. A byoji, he said cheerfully. Nadiya has something to show you. Minho's gaze moved from the poster to her face. She was certain her expression was a disaster. His was, as usual, composed, but his jaw was doing something tighter than usual, and his eyes were doing something entirely different from composed. Jihun, he said, voice level, go finish your homework. I already. Jihun. The boy retreated with the dignity of someone who had already won, and was merely allowing the adults to catch up. The room was very quiet. Nadiya set the poster down on the side table with hands that were steadier than she felt. I want you to know that I would never encourage him to. I know, Minho said. He came to me with this. I was about to explain to him that it wasn't appropriate. Something flickered through his expression. Not quite amusement, something more dangerous than that. Realistic, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she had to work to hold her ground. My son, he said finally, has very good instincts. She didn't breathe right for the rest of the day. 3 days later, the East Wing generator caught fire. It was a small fire, an electrical fault, contained quickly by the household's suppression system, but in the 3 minutes before the system activated, the corridor filled with smoke and the East Wing alarm screamed through the entire estate. Nadiya had been in the linen room at the end of the hall. She made it out, but the smoke inhalation left her coughing on the back steps, eyes streaming, wrapped in someone's emergency blanket that a security guard had pressed into her hands. She was sitting there, head down, catching her breath, when she felt a presence beside her that had nothing in common with a security guard. She looked up. Kang Min-ho was crouched in front of her. He was in his shirt sleeves, jacket discarded somewhere, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before. It was unguarded. The careful architecture of composure was still there, but underneath it, something was crackling through like voltage in a wire. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was different, stripped of the official register he usually wore. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out rougher than intended, still scraped by smoke. He didn't look like he believed her. His eyes moved over her face, her hands, cataloging in that thorough, unflinching way of his. Then he reached out and very carefully tucked the edge of the emergency blanket more firmly around her shoulders. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. It rearranged something in her chest. "The fire is contained," he said, but he didn't move away. "You'll be given the day." "I'm fine to work." "Nadiya," he said her name like it was a complete sentence, like it settled something. "Take the day." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was unreasonably clear, and the space between them was unreasonably small, and she was thinking things she had promised herself she would not think. "Okay," she said quietly. He stood. He was about to walk away. She watched him decide it, watched the composure come back up like armor, and then he stopped. "Jihun will want to see that you're all right," he said, without turning around. "He'll be difficult if he doesn't." "I'll find him," she said. A pause. "Good," he said, and walked back toward the house with the measured stride of a man, pretending he hadn't just crouched on a step, and tucked a blanket around someone's shoulders like it was the most natural thing he'd ever done. She stared at the garden for a very long time after that. The following week, the atmosphere in the estate shifted. It wasn't anything spoken or named. It was a frequency change, the difference between a room before lightning and a room after. Nadiya felt it everywhere. In the way Minho's gaze found her across the dining hall when she was setting the table for Jihun's after-school meal. In the way he paused his calls when she passed his open office door, his voice going briefly quieter as if he were aware of being overheard by someone whose opinion mattered. In the way Jihun watched them both with the barely concealed delight of a tiny architect watching his blueprint take shape. She kept her distance. It was safer. She knew what she was, staff, temporary, foreign, impractical in every way that counted in his world, and she knew what he was. Power, danger. The kind of man whose attention could be intoxicating right up until the moment it became something else entirely. She kept her distance, and he kept closing it. Not aggressively. Nothing that could be named or called out. A cup of tea that appeared on the windowsill of whatever room she was working in, the brand she'd mentioned to Mrs. Cho she preferred. A space heater that appeared in the East linen room 3 days after she'd shivered through a cold snap. Her station's schedule rearranged, quietly, without announcement, so that she was no longer working the 4 a.m. shift that had been running her into the ground. Mrs. Cho said nothing. She simply watched Nadiya discover each small thing with an expression that contained multitudes. "Someone rearranged my hours," Nadiya said one morning, clipboard in hand. "Did they?" Mrs. Cho said mildly. "It wasn't in the system as of last week." Systems update, said Mrs. Cho and refilled her tea. Jihun, meanwhile, had escalated. The poster had been the opening move. The follow-up campaign included, over the course of 7 days, a handwritten list titled Reasons Nadiya Should Stay Forever, 17 items, including she doesn't flinch when I talk about Uma, and she makes the house smell like actual food instead of flowers that aren't for eating. One formal dinner where he had maneuvered the seating, so that Nadiya was inexplicably invited to join the family table to discuss a school project that required, according to Jihun, a female perspective, and one incident where he told his father, directly and without blinking, "I think Nadiya is lonely sometimes, and you should do something about it." Minho had been very still for a moment after that. "Go to bed," he had said. "I'm just saying," Jihun replied, already retreating, already satisfied. The dinner was the crack in the wall. Nadiya had tried to decline. She had 3 separate professional reasons ready and had delivered the first one before Jihun gave her a look of such concentrated, sorrowful disappointment that she lost the other 2 entirely. She sat at the end of the long dining table in her work clothes, acutely aware of every wrong thing about the situation, and then Minho came in from his office and sat down at the head of the table and glanced toward her with an expression that was not surprise, he'd known, and nodded once, as if acknowledging something he'd been expecting and wasn't displeased about. Jihun narrated the meal. He did voices. He performed a dramatic retelling of a school debate in which he had apparently dismantled an opponent's argument with what he described as overwhelming evidence and also good timing. He asked Nadiya about Ghana loudly, eagerly, with the enthusiasm of a child whose curiosity had never been pruned, and she found herself talking without intending to about the market colors, her grandmother's kitchen, the particular quality of light in the afternoon back home. She glanced across the table at one point and found Minho watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not detached, not polite, something quieter and more concentrated than either, like he was memorizing something he was afraid of forgetting. She looked back at her food. Under the table, her hands were not entirely steady. The threat came from inside the house, which was almost funny. Chairman Kang, Minho's father, 72, retired in name only, arrived for a 2-day visit with his private secretary and his long-standing opinion that his son's household lacked suitable structure. The chairman had been the one to build the syndicate from the ground up, and he had opinions about everything: investments, territory, succession, and specifically the kind of woman appropriate for his son. He had brought one. Yoon Sara was 34, elegant, Yale-educated, from a Korean family with political connections that stretched to 3 separate ministries. She arrived with the chairman's party and moved through the estate with the practiced ease of someone auditioning for a role she'd been told was hers. She was also, Nadiya noted privately, watching Minho the way a tide watched ashore. Nadiya said nothing. She did her job. She was professional and invisible in the ways she'd trained herself to be, and she told herself it didn't matter because it didn't, because Minho was not hers, had never been hers, would never be. She was the staff, she was temporary, she was sensible. She rounded a corner on the second afternoon and walked directly into a conversation she hadn't been meant to hear. The chairman's voice carried in that particular way of men who'd spent decades expecting rooms to adjust to them rather than the other way around. "Sara is an appropriate match," he was saying. "The alliance benefits the Kang name and secures the Northern Territory negotiation. Jihun needs a mother. You need a partner who understands our world." A pause, then Minho's voice very even. "This isn't the time for that conversation." "It's past time. The boy is growing. You've been alone for 3 years, Minho. Sara is." I said not now. Nadiya had already backed away. She moved down the service corridor with her pulse doing something irrational and her hands tight around her cleaning supplies and her jaw clamped shut. It was fine. It was, in fact, completely irrelevant to her. She was the help. This was always how it was going to be. She was glad she hadn't done anything stupid. She was glad. She repeated this for the rest of the day at intervals, and believed it a little less each time. That evening, she was in the east corridor when she heard footsteps, not the light, rapid ones of Jihun or the measured beat of security. Purposeful, direct, and familiar. She kept her back to the hallway and continued straightening the side table. "You've been avoiding the main halls," Minho said. "I'm on the east wing rotation today." "You swapped with Mrs. Cho's assistant." She turned around. He was standing several feet away, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the way he looked when the official day had ended and he'd stopped performing ease and was simply himself. Which was, somehow, more dangerous. "Your guests require the main areas," she said carefully. "I was being practical." His eyes moved across her face with that thorough attention she'd never quite learned to withstand. "Sora is my father's guest," he said, "not mine." She held very still. "That distinction doesn't particularly change my rotation," she said. He took one step closer. "Nadiya." "Mr. Kang." "When it is just us," he said quietly, "that's not my name." The corridor was very still. The estate around them felt very far away. "What would you prefer I call you?" she asked, and her voice came out softer than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she'd only seen once before on the back steps, in the smoke-scraped morning, when his face had come briefly undone. "Minho," he said. She breathed in. She breathed out. "I should finish the corridor," she said. "You should," he agreed and didn't move. They stood there for one more moment that cost both of them something, and then Nadiya moved past him, carefully, not touching, not looking back, and Minho stood in the corridor of his own house and did not move for a while after she was gone. The attack came on the third night. It wasn't the Syndicate's enemies, or not directly. It was a splinter faction, men who'd been paid to make noise and create leverage, and they chose the estate because it was symbolic and because someone had told them Minho had grown complacent. They were wrong on the second count, but the damage came before the correction. 3 men entered through the east perimeter at 11:45. Security contained 2 immediately. The third made it to the east wing, Jihun's wing, before Minho's head of security reached him. Jihun was not in his room. Jihun, in the particular chaos of a 10-year-old who'd gotten thirsty and then distracted and then entirely sidetracked, was in the east sitting room showing Nadiya a constellation map he'd printed. At an hour he was absolutely not supposed to be awake. Nadiya heard the footsteps in the hall before the man appeared. What happened next lasted approximately 90 seconds and rearranged her understanding of herself. She moved Jihun behind her without thinking. She put herself between the door and the boy with the instinct of someone who had decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that this child was hers to protect. She grabbed the heavy brass reading lamp from the side table. She did not freeze. Security came through the door before she had to find out if the lamp would have been enough, but Minho was 15 seconds behind them, and what he saw when he entered the room, Nadiya, shaking, standing in front of his son with a lamp raised, his son's hands gripping the back of her sweater, made him cross the room in 4 steps. He took the lamp from her hands. His fingers closed over hers. He looked at her face. "Are you hurt?" Same question as the fire, same voice stripped and crackling. "No," she said. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until he was holding them. He didn't let go. Jihun, from behind her, said in a very small voice, "A byoji." Minho reached past Nadiya with his other arm and pulled his son against his side, and for a moment the 3 of them were very close together, and the world outside the room was very loud, and the world inside it was very quiet. Later, much later, after security had been briefed, and Jihun had been deposited into bed with the particular boneless relief of a child whose adrenaline had finally crashed, Minho found Nadiya in the east sitting room. She'd stayed to straighten it, because she needed something to do with her hands, because movement was better than stillness, because she was terrified that if she stopped she'd feel everything she was currently not letting herself feel. He stood in the doorway. She knew he was there before she saw him. "You protected him," he said. "Of course I did," She kept straightening things. He's a child. You could have left the window. I wasn't going to leave him. She turned. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. I want you to know I understand my position in this house. I understand what I am here and what I'm not. I understand the line. But that boy has spent 6 months talking to me about his mother and teaching me to fold cranes and making me read his school essays out loud so he can hear how they sound, and there is no line that would have made me walk out that window without him. Minho was very still. I know, he said. Nadiya. I should go to bed. She set down the cushion in her hands. It's late and tomorrow's schedule. Stop, he said quietly. She stopped. He crossed the room, not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate, the way he did everything. And he stopped when he was close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. I don't know, he said very quietly, how to do this. I have spent 3 years making certain I don't need anything from anyone. Jihun needs me, and I learned to live inside that because it was necessary. But I stopped, he paused. I stopped knowing how to want something for myself. She was not breathing correctly. And then you came into this house, he said, and you hummed songs that sounded like my son's grief, and you sat on floors to listen to him, and you stood between him and danger tonight without hesitating for a single second, and I... Another pause. Longer. I don't know how to keep pretending that I haven't noticed you from the beginning, that I haven't rearranged things to keep you here, that I haven't thought about you in ways that have nothing to do with this house or this job. The room was very quiet. Minho, she said, and her voice was barely sound. You don't have to say anything, he said. I just couldn't let tonight end without telling you. She looked at him, at the careful, cracked-open honesty of his face, at the man who commanded armies and dissolved threats and ran an empire from behind a mask of composure, standing in his own sitting room with all that armor down. She closed the space between them. It wasn't dramatic. It was one step, and then she was close enough for him to feel her breath, and then his hand came up to her face like he was handling something he'd been afraid to touch, and... The lamp in the corner flickered. Outside, a guard's radio crackled. What happened in the quiet of that room between one breath and the next belongs to them. But when the door to the east sitting room was checked at 2 a.m., it was empty, and both of them would carry the weight of that night differently than they'd carried anything before. She was gone before dawn. Not from the estate, her things were still in her room, her schedule still on the board, but from his reach, which was the kind of gone that mattered. By the time Minho came down the next morning, Nadiya had rerouted herself to the West Wing with a schedule change. She'd submitted to Mrs. Cho at 5 a.m., and she was professionally, precisely, comprehensively unavailable. He understood it immediately. He also understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that she was afraid. Not of him, she'd never been afraid of him, which had undone him from the beginning. She was afraid of what came next, of being something real and temporary in a life built around permanent forces, of trusting a moment in a sitting room and waking up to discover it hadn't meant to a man who ran an empire what it had meant to her. He knew this because he'd watched her build walls for 8 months and recognized the architecture. He gave her 3 days. 3 days during which Jihun sensed something was wrong with radar children, had for the particular frequencies of adult tension, and began appearing in Nadiya's path again, not with schemes, this time, but with the quiet constancy of a child who decided she needed company. He didn't explain. He just showed up. He brought his homework. He talked about ordinary things. He sat with her while she worked and didn't mention his father and didn't push. He was 10 years old and he understood, in the way children sometimes understood things before adults could admit them, that she needed someone to stay without requiring anything from her. She made it exactly 2.5 days before she cried, privately in the linen room, with Jihun's school essay about the person he admired most in her hands, which was titled Nadiya, and ran to 700 words. On the 4th day, Minho found her. Not in the East Wing. In the garden, at the far edge of the estate, where the manicured grounds gave way to a rougher stretch of hillside, and the city spread below in afternoon light. She was sitting on a low stone wall, jacket pulled tight, looking at something in the middle distance. He sat beside her without asking. She didn't move away. "I don't know how to fit into your life," she said before he could say anything. "I know what I am to the outside world. I know what your father thinks. I know what your world looks like, and I know what happens to people who don't fit the edges of it." She looked at him. "I don't want to be something that costs you." "Nadiya," he said. "I'm serious." "So am I," he held her gaze. "I've spent 15 years managing costs. Territory, alliances, leverage, everything reduced to what it costs and what it buys. That's how I was built." A pause. "You are the first thing in 15 years that I have not thought about in terms of cost." Her breath caught. "What do you think about me in terms of?" she asked, very quietly. "What I would lose," he said, "if I let you go." The chairman made his position clear 2 days later. He called Minho into the formal study and presented his case the way he presented everything, as foregone conclusion, as syndicate logic, as the shape of things as they had to be. The Yoon alliance is necessary. Sora has agreed. The arrangement is practical. Whatever distraction has occurred in this household should be resolved quietly. The woman's contract ended generously, and... "No," Minho said. The chairman stopped. In 40 years, people did not say no to Chairman Kang in that tone. Not once. Not his enemies, not his allies, not his lieutenants, and not, until this moment, his son. "This is not a discussion," the chairman said. "You're right," Minho said. "It's a decision. Mine." He stood. "Nadiya stays. The arrangement with Sora ends. The Northern Territory negotiation will proceed through different channels that I've already identified." He adjusted his jacket. "This house is mine. Jihun is my son. The decisions made in both will be mine." The chairman was very still. "You would risk everything," he said slowly. "I would risk everything," Minho said, "for the person who stood between my son and a man with bad intentions without flinching. For the person who has given Jihun back something I didn't know how to give him. For the person who is the first thing in 3 years that has made me feel like the world isn't just a series of threats to be managed." He met his father's eyes. "So yes, everything." He walked out. There was fallout. There was always fallout with the chairman, and it came in the form of syndicate pressure, of whispers through the organization, of 2 lieutenants who mistook the shifting of power for opportunity. Minho handled all of it in the systematic way he handled everything, thoroughly, without excess, and with the kind of finality that reminded people why he was feared. What he couldn't handle, for 4 days, was finding Nadiya. Because she had heard about the confrontation. Mrs. Cho, with her particular talent for strategic information delivery, had told her not unkindly, not without purpose, and Nadiya had gone very still and then very quiet, and then 2 days later had submitted a resignation letter to Mrs. Cho citing personal reasons. Mrs. Cho had sat on it for 24 hours before telling Minho. He drove to the agency address she'd listed in her file at 7 in the morning. She wasn't there. He drove to the university district, to the address of the friend she'd listed as emergency contact. He found her at a cafe 3 blocks from the friend's apartment, nursing a coffee, luggage at her feet. She saw him through the window before he came in. She didn't run. He wasn't sure if that was good or terrifying. He sat down across from her. The cafe was almost empty. Someone was grinding espresso beans. The morning light came through at an angle that made everything feel very clear. "You were going to leave," he said. "You fought your father for me," she said. "Do you understand how much pressure that puts on a person, on what we are, on whatever this," she gestured between them, "on whatever this is that hasn't even been named yet?" "Then let's name it," he said. She stared at him. "I have been in love with exactly one person in my life," he said, steadily, quietly, like he was stating a fact about territory or weather or anything else real. "She died, and I decided that was the last time I would let anything inside the walls because the cost of losing it was unbearable." He looked at her. "And then you walked into my house and spent 8 months teaching my son to fold cranes and standing in fires and singing songs and being impossibly yourself, and every wall I built is currently rubble. So," He placed his hands flat on the table. Name it with me. Or tell me it's nothing and I will walk out that door and never put this in front of you again. But you have to tell me, because I am not capable of pretending I don't know what I want anymore. The espresso grinder stopped. The cafe was very quiet. Nadiya looked at him for a long moment, at this man who was power and danger and controlled chaos, and underneath all of it, grief that looked a great deal like her own, and felt herself stop running. Jihun proposed to me first, she said finally. Something cracked across his face that was almost a smile. He told me. He said he was securing the territory before I figured out the situation. A real laugh broke out of her, surprised, helpless, the kind that undid everything. And Minho, who had not laughed in a very long time, laughed with her. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. 6 months later. The Kang estate looked different in spring. The iron gates were the same, the security cameras the same, the guards still there. But the east wing had been opened up, the garden redesigned slightly to include a section that Jihun had claimed for growing things. And the kitchen smelled, with some regularity, of the kind of cooking that made the whole house feel inhabited in a way it hadn't in years. Jihun stood at the top of the east stairs in his finest clothes, hands behind his back, with the expression of someone who had successfully executed a long-term operation and was awaiting the results. Below, in the garden, Minho stood beside Nadiya under the evening sky. She had known something was happening. Jihun had been twitchy for a week. Mrs. Cho had been suspiciously serene. The security detail had arranged itself in a very specific pattern around the garden perimeter that suggested ceremony rather than threat. When Minho reached into his jacket pocket, she pressed her hand to her mouth. "I was told," he said, crouching in front of her on one knee with the gravity of a man who had knelt before nothing and no one and had decided this was different, "that I was too slow. By someone who is 10 years old and significantly more decisive than I am. Minho, you walked into my house and gave my son back the sound of his mother's songs. You gave him a reason to wake up early. You gave me back something I had stopped believing I was allowed to have." He looked up at her, and his face was entirely, completely open, no armor, no composure, no distance, just him. "I would like you to stay. Not as staff, not as temporary, not as anything that can be ended by resignation or rearrangement. I would like you to stay as mine, as Jihun's. As the person this house has been waiting for since it forgot what it meant to be a home." He opened the box. The ring was simple, gold, warm, with a small setting that somehow looked exactly like her. "Nadiya Osei," said Kang Min-ho, feared in every room in Seoul, kneeling in his own garden in the evening light. "Will you marry me?" From the top of the stairs, very clearly, Jihun whispered, "I asked her first." She laughed, tears and laughter together, the way only real things came. "Yes," she said, and held out her hand. 1 year later. The wedding was small by Kang standards, which still meant 200 guests, a ceremony overlooking the Han River, and Jihun as the ring-bearer who managed the moment with tremendous solemnity right up, until he tripped on the step and recovered so smoothly that 3 guests thought it was choreographed. The chairman came. He sat in the 3rd row and said nothing, and at the reception he found Nadiya before she found him, and he looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had cracked open his son's chest and planted something living there, and bowed slightly, which was as much as the chairman had bowed to anyone in 40 years. She bowed back. They understood each other. 7 months after the wedding. The East Wing nursery had been Jihun's idea. He'd presented the redesigned proposal to his father with color swatches and a floor plan, completely unprompted, 2 days after Nadiya had pressed Minho's hand to her rounding stomach in the early morning light, and said, "There," and watched his face do the thing it did now, the open, unguarded thing that she had somehow become the only person on earth who could bring out of him. Jihun named the proposal Operation Little One and submitted it with a cover note that read, "I did the research." On a bright morning in the East Wing, in a house that smelled like real cooking and sounded like laughter, Kang Min-ho sat in the oversized chair by the window with his daughter asleep against his chest, and his wife reading in the chair beside him, and his son doing homework on the floor with his socked feet in the air. And he felt the exact shape of what his life had been trying to become for years before it knew how to get there. Nadiya looked up from her book and found him watching her. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, and looked back at his daughter's face. Then, everything. She smiled and went back to her book, and outside the garden was green and the city moved and the gates stood, and somewhere in the machinery of the Kang Syndicate, 40 men continued to be afraid of Minho, which was, he had decided, entirely separate from this. From the warm weight in his arms. From the woman beside him. From the boy on the floor. This was not the Empire. This was better.